Okay, this is it. This is the last video in our series of Prelude to War. What is building up all of this fervor, all of this anxiety, all of this tension to get ready for the war itself to begin, right? This is the closing years before we get Abraham Lincoln on the scene and we have the Republican Party and the Southern secession. Today, we're going to talk about the last few years. And this is an incredibly important section. And so in your notes, you need to include this as Prelude to War Part 5. This picture right here is actually going to be is a image of a compromise that will take place right before the war in an effort to try to stop a future battle from happening. We're going to talk about it next. So, politics is relative. And in 1848, there's a presidential election, and there's 3 candidates. And as you can imagine, between those 3 candidates, the big issue is, what could it be? Oh, I know, slavery, right? So there's 3 candidates. Lewis Cass, a Democrat, Martin Van Buren, the Free Soil Party, or an abolitionist, and our buddy, Zachary Taylor, Mr. Old Rough and Ready. Remember the guy that was sent into war to provoke war with Mexico by James Polk, right? Now, the 3 parties are going at it, and you can look at this and you can think, well, the Democrats are going to favor Cass, so that's going to be most of the South. And if you see here on the map below, he picks up a large number of southern states. Mainly, many of them where they have a majority, a large slave population, like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, right? Martin Van Buren picks up few, and that's mainly because people don't really know him as well, but also because he's an abolitionist. He's pretty far to the left of all of these ideas, whereas Cass will be pretty far to the right of all these ideas. And so square in the middle is Zachary Taylor, old Rough and Ready. He runs with the Whig Party, and he's a war hero. And the thing that's attractive about him is nobody actually knows anything really about him. He's never voted for anything in his life. He's never held political office. And so for a lot of people, they say, well, listen, I've got, Van Buren who would be in favor of abolishing slavery. I've got Cass who'd be in favor of expanding slavery. So let's go with Zachary Taylor, because you have nothing else. He'll maybe just keep the status quo. He'll kick the can down the road, right? And he wins a narrow victory as a result and becomes president of the United States. Now, not long after that, gold is found in California. It's Sutter's Mill, and one of the first things Zachary Taylor's going to have to deal with as the new president is this expansion of this movement and migration of people into California. California population explodes by 1849, and from 14,000 in 1848 to over 100,000 in 1849. And it's enough people to actually start a state. Here you go, sports reference again, actually. California has a football team in San Francisco called the 49ers, named after the 49ers, the people who moved to California during the gold rush of 1849. As a result, California becomes a really lawless, kind of wild place. When it does come up for an issue of statehood, and when it comes to the issue of slavery, most Californians are in favor of no slavery. They don't want it expanded there. But, as you can imagine, if there's going to be no slavery there, then that's going to tip the balance in the favor of the North when it comes to Congress, and that's going to be an issue, and so the South has a number of fears. 1, they were afraid of slaves. They're paranoid of them. They're worried that their slaves are going to rise up and murder them in the middle of the night at any point, right? 2, they're afraid of California becoming a free state because that's going to give the free states more power in Congress. And 3, they're worried about slave rebellions and runaways. And so all of this is really going to start to charge them up and get them worried. And so when the issue of California statehood comes on the table in 1850, they're really going to put up a big fuss because they don't want to lose that political power that they have. They're already scared enough as it is. So the Compromise of 1850 happens as a result. Southerners say, listen, if you're going to make California a free state, then we got to get something back. The North gets a couple of things. 1, they get California as a free state. 2, New Mexico and Utah get to decide on what is known as popular sovereignty, which basically means, if you remember sovereignty, this idea we talked about last year, see, popular sovereignty is people decide. People have the ultimate say, right? And so what's going to happen here is New Mexico and Utah are going to get to decide, do they want to be a free state or do they want to be admitted as a slave state? The people are going to vote on it. The North gets the abolishment of the slave trade in D.C., and that's no small task. I mean, the slave trade had been made millionaires out of many people. The South is largely willing to let that go, though, because most slaves at this time are not still imported slaves from Africa. There have been generations of people living in the colonies or in the United States. They've been encouraged to have children, and so many people are just born into slavery because their parents were slaves. So there's not as much of a desire or a need for slaves being brought over from Africa anymore. Most slaves at this time, most people who were born into who are slaves were born into it basically because their parents were slaves, and you immediately owned them if you were a plantation owner. So what does the South get? Well, the South gets a number of things. One, they get a stricter fugitive slave law. What that meant is if you were a fugitive, if you had run away as a slave, the South basically gets the right to take you back, right? And so even if you were in the North, what happens is that if you're in the North and you were a runaway slave, you could have a slave catcher who could actually capture you and bring you back to the South. Just because you're there doesn't mean you're free. Congress also says they have no jurisdiction over the slave trade. So even though it's kind of falling away, international slave trade, domestic slave trade, Congress will not, get involved. Also, Congress would not abolish slavery in D.C. So even though they got rid of the slave trade, slavery in D.C. Is not going to be done away with. Here's the thing. Even though the South got a lot of good stuff there for Southerners, this still angers a number of them. And one of them is this gentleman over here, John C. Calhoun, who I kind of put this picture up kind of funny because he oddly kind of looks like Sam the Eagle from the Muppets, in my opinion. But John C. Calhoun is so enraged by the Compromise of 1850 that they're going to allow California to be admitted as a free state automatically, and that because there's no guarantee that New Mexico and Utah are going to become slave states, he's like, you know what? This is it. I say we just secede now. Let us separate in peace, he says. At the last moment, Stephen Douglas, a senator who we'll talk about a lot more in the next few weeks, he ends up saying, I got a way to get this legislation passed through, this compromise. He takes the compromise and he breaks it up into 8 different bills. That's eight different bills, right? He takes them and he separates them out and he says, all right, we'll try to pass each one. And as we do, we'll gain more stuff, right? And so he's actually pretty successful. He separates them out. They're individually all passed on their own. And the Compromise of 1850 happens. Again, this is not necessarily dealing with the institution of slavery. It's kind of kicking this can down the road. And as you can see now, when it comes to popular sovereignty, that's a political issue. And so there's going to be people who move into these territories and try to encourage you in some ways, or maybe forcefully tell you how you should vote. This is going to be a problem, this idea of popular sovereignty, when we get to the issues of Nebraska and Kansas. And when they're admitted into the Union, how do we decide if they're free or they're slave, right? Well, if we're going to do popular sovereignty, we're going to learn the lessons in New Mexico and Utah. We're going to, if you're a Southerner, you're going to say, well, maybe I moved there and maybe I encourage those people to vote this way. And that's what's going to happen. And so that's it. The reason why the Compromise of 1850 is so important is it sets up this idea of popular sovereignty. That's going to be a big idea when we get to Kansas and Nebraska, and we start talking about what is known as bleeding Kansas. And it's going to be the first time we're going to see an individual who is quite interesting by the name of John Brown. He's going to create a lot of issues. Him, Garrison, a couple of slave revolts, and the next thing you know, we're going to be on the precipice of war. That's all next time. For now, make sure you have all this in your notes. If you have any questions, make sure you add those too. We'll talk about this more in class, and we'll talk about why this is so important. Be prepared to do that. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and take care. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.